This really happened to me, and telling it still makes my hands shake. I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to tell you exactly how I lost everything on a Tuesday night in Portland and what I did to get it back. My husband told me he'd gambled away our savings while we were sitting at our scarred oak kitchen table, the one that came with the creaky craftsman bungalow we rented off S.E. Clinton Street. The phone he dropped between us glowed like an accusation. Our joint account balance, $63.17, reflected back at me while a cold draft slipped under the back door and rattled the keys in the blue ceramic bowl. There was leftover pizza growing stiff in a cardboard box, and we were supposed to be going over our monthly budget, just the two of us, bills spread out, the ritual where he liked to play the responsible one. Instead, the truth spilled across the table with the smell of cold mozzarella and the sight of a number so small it felt like a joke. His voice cracked when he admitted it, but his eyes were flat, almost daring me not to believe him. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel. Tell us where you're from and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. For years, I believed in the protective magic of a routine. I trusted that if I brewed the coffee exactly right, if I folded the towels warm from the dryer, if I kept the ledger tidy and filled the freezer with batch-cooked chili, things would hold. That's what my mom always said when she called me from Eugene, where she kept her life smaller on purpose. Routines are the net, June. Keep your hands busy, and the world will feel less slippery. When I first met Adam, he was a cook who smelled like bacon fat and clove cigarettes, the kind of man who knew how to order at a place like Screen Door without looking at the menu. He could talk to anyone. He had a laugh that made waitresses lean in, a chin scar from a bike crash in college, and a habit of brushing his thumb against his lower lip when he lied. I didn't know about the last part until later. We'd go to Laurelhurst Theater on weeknights and share a craft beer under the flicker of old sci-fi films. We'd walk past Powell's, and I'd insist we duck inside just for 5 minutes, and he'd tease me that 5 minutes in Powell's was an hour everywhere else. The poker started as a hobby, a Tuesday night thing with his co-workers that sounded less threatening than it was because it came with Costco salsa and a neighbor's old green felt mat. He brought home stories about impossible hands, the math of it, the strange brotherhood men find when they're facing each other over chips and pretending it's skill and not fate. I still have a picture from that first year. A pyramid of red plastic cups, Adam grinning behind them like a king of small things. We were saving to buy into a duplex on SE Division. We had a shared spreadsheet, color-coded in cheerful blues and greens, with a tab labeled Dreams, where I wrote store in shy little capitals. I wanted a place like the ones in the Alberta Arts District, light pouring over mismatched chairs, plants dangling, second-hand dresses hung from copper rods, a candle that smelled like cedar and clean linen. I wanted to call it June House, even though my name is June, and naming things after yourself is shameless. He said it was cute. He kissed my forehead and said, "One day." When the pandemic came through and then receded and then came through again, the restaurant kept him on because he could work a line like a machine. He got a promotion to sous, a pay bump, a sense of invincibility that people get when they've never had to look over their shoulder. I got laid off by the little marketing firm that had me writing captions for brands that pretended to be friends. I picked up freelance work, made Etsy prints of hand-lettered Oregon landmarks, and built our savings with every PayPal notification, feeling proud that the number could tick up even in a world that kept tilting. The night he confessed, I watched the digits on his phone and tried to make them rearrange through sheer force. "Where is it?" I asked. "Where did it go?" I could hear the neighbors laughing in their backyard, the clink of a bottle on a glass table, and somewhere far away, a train horn. He didn't cry. Not really. A line pulled tight at the corner of his mouth. "Spirit Mountain," he said finally, as if naming it made it a pilgrimage and not a drain in the floor of our lives, and some online stuff, just until I got back where I needed to be. I kept almost winning it back, June. You don't understand. I understood dissociation. I understood the plastic feeling moment when your mind floats up to the ceiling to avoid the blow. I stared at the too bright phone and felt a part of me step outside the room and take notes. The checks due, the rent on the first, the credit cards, mine good, his dangerous, the dentist appointment I'd already rescheduled twice because I was trying to be careful, our spreadsheet, the tab that said dreams. How much? My voice sounded older. He cleared his throat. All of it, he said, like a confession that, if delivered with enough gravity, would be absolution. 42,000. It was a ridiculous number because it was specific and because it was every single extra thing we'd scraped together. Every tax refund melted into it. Every side job I'd taken where I smiled at strangers and pretended I didn't care if they undervalued me. I saw his thumb hover near his bottom lip, and I would, months later, go back in my mind and understand how often he'd done that when telling me the rent was covered or that he was handling the car insurance. A long time ago, I'd said I didn't want to be the kind of couple who went through each other's mail. I thought trust was a gift you wrapped once and assumed would stay unopened on a shelf. There was a sound then, 3 slow chimes from the doorbell, each one tinny, marching down the hallway like a warning. The dog in the apartment next door barked once and fell silent. Adam flinched. "Were you expecting someone?" I asked. He didn't answer. He stood, wiped his hands on his jeans like they were wet, and went to the door. The man on our porch was tall, wearing a black jacket despite the warm September evening, a Portland Timbers cap pulled down low, and the kind of smile I remembered from the boys in my high school who broke the rules and never paid for it. "Adam," he said, cool as a river stone, "you stopped answering your phone." I felt the box of pizza, the drafts, the glow of the bank app recede behind me as I stood and stepped closer. The man's eyes slid to me and then away so quickly it might have been accidental if it weren't a practiced disrespect. "You must be June," he said. "I'm Victor." "I'm not buying anything," I said, "because that's what you say when a stranger on your porch brings a tone you didn't invite." "Me neither." He tipped his cap. "But someone does owe me." When the door closed and Adam's voice dropped to a smeared whisper, I told myself I would not be one of those wives who pretended she hadn't heard what she had. I opened the door again. "If you have business with my husband," I said, "it's business with me. This is a community property state." I was wrong. Oregon isn't. But the sentence felt like a shield. Victor's smile returned. Sharper. "Not today," he said, and his gaze took in the IKEA bookshelf behind me, crowded with cookbooks, the framed map of Oregon with a coffee ring near Salem, the yellow planter I bought at City Liquidators that morning because I was trying to make the house look bright and hopeful. "You kids enjoy your night," he added. "We'll be in touch." After he left, Adam tried to make the house feel small. He sat, put his face in his hands, and played the tired script of a man who wishes the truth were less true. He said he could fix it. He said there was a game tomorrow, a sure thing. He said my worry was making it worse. He said, "You're the pragmatic one, June. Give me space to fix this." Somewhere in the middle of his apologies, a second voice in my mind, a voice that uses full names and dates, stood up and took charge. I had never felt it before with such clarity. It told me that if I didn't set a boundary right now, there would be no boundaries left to set. I pulled my laptop closer and opened our spreadsheet. The cheerful blues and greens looked obscene. I clicked File, Make a Copy, and retitled it Damage Control. I slept on the couch that night and kept the porch light on. At 2:13 a.m., I got up and wrote down every bill with a due date. At 3:07, I searched Oregon dissipation of marital assets divorce and fell into a rabbit hole of legal blogs and court summaries that may as well have been written in Icelandic. At 4:49, I wrote an email to myself with the subject line, "When you wake up, do not minimize this." At 5 house, I put on sneakers and went walking down Clinton, past a line of scooters sleeping like birds, past the mural that says, "Keep Portland Weird," past a coffee shop just pulling up its metal grate, the barista inside a silhouette against the bluish light. The city had that empty plate feeling before breakfast, when anything might be cooked. I inhaled the air and promised myself I would build something out of the wreck. Adam was gone when I returned. A note on the table. "I'll be right back. Don't worry." The thumbprint of a lie. I wish I could tell you I broke up with him that morning, that I was one of those women who recognizes a fire when she smells smoke. Instead, I became the foreman of a triage unit. I moved money from the emergency card to cover rent. I set up automatic deposits on a savings account he couldn't access. My name only, opened at a credit union on S.E. Hawthorne, where the manager had kind eyes. I emailed my old boss and asked for overflow work, and when she said yes, I took every dreary product page and wrote captions with the surgical precision of someone whose life depends on the rhythm of verbs and nouns. That afternoon I called my mother. She listened without interrupting, her breath like a quiet wind on the line. "He's sick," she said finally. Sick is not the same as evil, but sick can break things just as easily. "Baby, what do you need?" I wanted to say, to be held, to have the clock pause for an hour, to forget my own name. Instead, I said, "A plan." "Then make one," she said. "Name it, write it down, and don't let him move you off it." So I opened a fresh page and wrote, in ink so dark it bled. 1. Secure accounts. 2. Find a lawyer who takes payment plans. 3. Figure out if the house of cards can stand while I build a better one. 4. Remember June House. Not someday. Now. The last line was, at the time, preposterous. What kind of person opens a store when they're underwater, when a man named Victor can press a finger to their doorbell like a metronome? But every calculation I did kept circling back to the same ugly arithmetic. I could spend a year patching holes, or I could spend a year building something meant to float. I went to the Alberta Arts District like a pilgrim in jeans and a thrifted jacket that made me look like I had a plan. Salt and Straw was doing their weird ice cream flavors. Olive oil, pear, and blue cheese. The sun slid between clouds, made the windows flash. I stood in front of a narrow storefront with a for-lease sign curling in one corner. Phone number hand-lettered by a landlord who wanted calls from steady people. My reflection looked like a woman rehearsing for a play where she pretended to be capable. A man behind me said, "You going for it?" And I turned to find a stranger in paint-splattered Carhartts, the kind of neighbor who has a key to half the buildings on the block. "Maybe," I said. "I'm just looking." "Everyone's just looking," he said friendly. "I'm Griffin. I do build-outs. You call Khalil, he'll show it to you. But if you're looking for a sign, there isn't one. You either do it or you don't." I laughed because I hadn't said any of that out loud. Griffin shrugged like he was used to ghosts telling him what people needed. "I'll be around," he said. "I'm painting the salon until 6. I called the number. Khalil answered on the second ring and came down in a gray sweater that looked expensive and a smile that looked skeptical. The space was small and beautiful if you squinted, paint-peeling brick, a concrete floor cracked like a map, a back room that smelled like stale incense and damp. Previous tenant tried to sell crystals and incense, he said. Great energy, bad bookkeeping. "How much?" I asked. He told me. It was more than I wanted and less than I feared. "I can't pay 3 months' deposit," I said before he could ask. "I can do one if you let me do the paint and fixtures. I'll make it pretty, I swear." He tilted his head. "What is the business?" "Vintage and home goods," I said, the sentence arriving fully formed. as if I had been carrying it under my tongue for years. Consignment from local makers and estates, plants, candles I pour myself, and a little corner for workshops where people can learn to sew on a button and hem pants and make the kind of changes that make you feel like you don't have to throw your whole life out. Khalil looked at the space and then at me. You have credit? I have grit, I said, and immediately wished I could swallow the word back. Because who says grit without sounding like a commercial? And a very small cushion, and I'll get a microloan. Prosper Portland? He asked, and when I nodded, he said, if they write you a letter of intent, I'll shave the deposit. You'll need insurance, a city permit, and a plan. He handed me a pen. Name of the business? June House, I said, and my voice did not shake. Khalil wrote it down. You know the rent is due every first on time? Yes. No late fees waived? Yes. No drama? Yes, I said, and the word was both promise and prayer. When I stepped back onto Alberta, Griffin waved with his roller, like we were old friends. I walked to Proud Mary Coffee and bought the cheapest thing on the menu so I could sit and open my laptop. I drafted a business plan with the wild calm that comes over nurses in triage. I listed revenue streams. I mapped out pop-ups at the Portland Saturday Market and the Montevilla Farmers Market to build a following before opening day. I set up an Instagram for Agwal June House PDX and posted a picture of the empty space with the caption, Building. Something with my own two hands. Alberta Arts Chalk Portland Makers. Women who build. It felt performative and also like a note tied to a balloon. If you read this, pull. I will pull back. When I looked up from the screen, my heart thudded once in that old animal way. Parked half a block down, a gray Tacoma I knew too well, idled with its lights off, a shadow behind the wheel watching the corner, and the little painted door that would soon belong to me. Adam had followed me, or he had reason to be here, and either way, I understood the message. A gambler knows the table where the stakes are highest. I took a breath that tasted like coffee and resolve and stood up, ready to walk toward the truck I used to ride in and the man I used to trust, when the passenger door opened and Victor stepped out first, smiling like he'd been waiting to watch me walk toward the future so he could decide whether to help it burn. I didn't run. I tucked my laptop into my bag and went to meet them. The next morning, I woke to an email from Prosper Portland with the subject line, "Let's talk about your application." It was the kind of sentence that contained 100 different possible lives. I clicked it with a thumb that barely trembled. I had one shot to convince a city office I wasn't a vanity project in a neighborhood already decorated with vanities. I was a woman who needed to make $42,000 materialize from air in 12 months while dodging the gravity of a man who thought odds were something he could bully into submission. I was the person the younger version of me might have admired if I hadn't been so busy trying to be nice. By noon, I had a phone consultation scheduled with a woman named Latasha who sounded like she knew how to turn a ship. By 2, I'd met a lawyer on SW 6th Avenue who offered a free 30-minute consultation in a conference room with a view of the river and a plant that needed water. "This is dissipation," she said, flipping through the bank statements I printed at the credit union. "It'll matter at final judgment. But in the meantime, we keep lights on. You can file for separation and ask the court to restrain him from transferring assets. We can request temporary support, but that takes time. Do you have somewhere safe to go if he escalates?" I thought of our house with the rattling keys and said, yes, because another friend had a basement studio and because safety is as much about the shape of your spine as the shape of your locks. "Document everything," the lawyer said, passing me a sheet that felt like a life raft printed on paper. "Every withdrawal, every text, every time he shows up where you are, and don't talk to the victor of your story. These men don't go away because you're polite." When I stepped out into the glare of a rare, clear Portland day, I felt both terrified and indestructible, which is a very specific cocktail and not recommended on an empty stomach. I walked along the waterfront, past joggers in neon, past a couple arguing about the proper way to fold a map, which was adorable because it was an actual paper map, and called Latasha back to read her the bones of my plan. She asked the questions that cut fluff from muscle, and when we were done, she said, "Bring me 3 years of taxes, your lease draft, and a list of initial inventory sources. We'll talk microloan." "Thank you," I said, and meant it like a benediction. That night, I went home and found Adam on the couch, watching highlights of a Timbers match that looked like a fight choreography class. He muted the TV when I came in. "You're making a mistake," he said without preamble. "You're making a scene. Victor doesn't like scenes." "Victor doesn't get to like or dislike anything about my life," I said. "Neither do you." He looked at me then, really looked, and I recognized the moment when a person realizes you've moved to a place they can't reach by persuasion. He wiped his thumb across his mouth and nodded, slow and thoughtful. "You think you're the hero?" he said, "but no one opens a store and wins." I smiled in a way that felt new in my face. "Watch me." His mouth twitched. "You'll be calling me in a month, June." I folded the letter from Prosper Portland into thirds like a talisman and slid it into my bag. "No," I said softly, "you'll be reading about me in a year." He laughed then, but it was a small, mean sound, and I understood that there are men who'd rather be the villain in a story than an exit sign. I locked the bedroom door that night and slept with my phone under my pillow, the blue light seeping through fabric like a secret sunrise. At 2 a.m., the dog next door barked again, then stopped. At 3, the house sighed as if giving up a breath it had been holding too long. At 4, I dreamed of a storefront with my name lettered in white paint, the glass reflecting a woman who looked tired and dangerous in the best way. I was still smiling at the dream when, an hour later, the porch light flicked on by itself and slow footsteps crossed our wooden steps, each one deliberate, as if the person on the other side of the door wanted me to know they were there, and that morning, like the truth, had finally arrived. I stood up, heartbeat loud in my ears, and reached for the doorknob, bracing myself for a voice that would try to turn my life into a negotiation when the first rap sounded, gentle, almost courteous, and a second shadow joined the first on the frosted glass, too tall, too still, too patient to be anything except what I'd been dreading. I opened the door anyway. The porch smelled like wet wood and old leaves. Victor stood where the light made his face look carved. Beside him, not Adam, but a woman in a camel coat, her hair slicked back, a clipboard in her hand. "June?" she asked, and her voice was brisk but not unkind. "Yes." "I'm Naomi," she said, holding up an ID I didn't recognize. "Collections agent, retained by a lender who believes your husband is reachable through conventional means." Her gaze flickered toward Victor, which told me more than the ID did. "We're looking for Adam." "He isn't here," I said. "That's interesting," Victor said, "because his truck is around the corner, and because he's been making promises out of your living room." "I make my own promises," I said, "and I keep them." Naomi tapped her clipboard with a pen. "This can go one of 2 ways," she said. "One is civilized, the other is expensive." "I vote civilized," I said. "You can both leave my porch, and I'll let you know when the court has told me what portion of his debts I'm legally required to shoulder, which, as I understand it, is nothing he incurred without my consent during his impressive solo adventures." I smiled with all my teeth. In other words, nothing. Victor's smile thinned. "You learned words," he said, like an insult. "I also learned locks," I said, and closed the door, snapping the deadbolt with a sound that felt like a drum beat. My hands were shaking so hard I had to lean them flat against the wood. On the other side, I heard Naomi exhale and say, "We'll be in touch," and Victor murmur, "She'll call." I didn't. I called the lawyer at 8:59 a.m. and said, "File for legal separation today. Motion to restrain him from moving assets. and tell me how to tell a man like Victor to stop knocking on my door." "You don't," she said. "You get a protective order if he harasses you, and you document, and you stop being at the door when he is." "Copy," I said, because I speak fluently when I'm moving forward. Before noon, I had new locks, courtesy of Griffin, who refused payment and said, "Pay me with coffee when you open." I texted Latasha a picture of my taxes and a list of makers I'd already pitched. Leanne at Redux had offered consignment advice in a flurry of heart emojis and blunt truths. An estate sale in Selwood had promised vintage kitchenware if I could pick it up by Friday. A ceramics grad from PNCA had DM'd me to say she'd been waiting for a shop like mine. The city's hum felt tinny and bright and dangerous under my skin, but it was my city and my danger, and that mattered more than I can explain. By Friday morning, I was holding a lease draft with Khalil's signature at the bottom and a penciled-in move-in date I could hardly believe. I looked at the date and saw a little doorway opening in the calendar, a clean-edged hole where a life might fit. I turned the key in the empty shop for the first time, sunlight falling in long stripes across the concrete like ribs, and heard someone clear his throat behind me. I didn't need to turn to know who it was. The air changes when certain men enter a room. It gets thinner, like a mountaintop. "Nice," Adam said, in a voice that sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. "You always wanted a place-to-play house." I put my bag down on the floor, where the counter would be, and traced the outline with my toe. "This is not a play," I said. "This is where I make back $42,000 in 12 months. He laughed, short and ugly, "And I suppose you'll do that with macrame plant hangers and little brass candlesticks." "With work," I said, "the way people do." "Victor says, 'Stop saying his name in my store,'" I said, and the word store clicked into the walls like a command. Adam blinked. I could see him calculating how to undermine, how to reassert dominion, how to pivot into charm if anger didn't take. He walked to the back wall, ran his hand along the peeling brick like he owned it, and said, "You know what they tell you when you sit at the table too long? Cash out while you're ahead. You're not ahead, June. You're the mark." I thought of the last year, the way my muscles had started to notice themselves, the way my voice had acquired edges. I thought of the line my mother had taught me to draw, and how I'd been practicing drawing it in invisible ink. I picked up the lease, the cold metal of the key winking in my palm, and said, "Get out." He tilted his head, that slow, mocking tilt I used to find charming, because it meant he was about to turn a fight into a joke. "Make me." "I won't," I said, "but the police will the next time you step over a line that isn't yours, and when you step out, don't come back unless it's with a signed agreement to seek treatment and a clear plan to pay me back, or a court order that says you have a right to breathe the air in here. Until then, this is my place, Adam. You can cheer, or you can leave." He looked like he wanted to clap slow, just to be cruel. Instead, he walked to the door, paused with his hand on the knob, and said without turning, "You don't win with a store." There are moments when you realize the villain doesn't know how the story ends, because he has never stayed long enough to see anyone else reach the last page. I let him go without another word, watched him cross the strip of light, and promised the room that I would not miss a single day that needed me. I would build shelves. I would paint the brick a clean white. I would lay a rug that felt like a promise and set candles that smelled like cedar and clean linen. And survival. I would put my name on the window in white letters and invite strangers to come in and reimagine what they were worth. The very next morning, before the paint was dry, and while the first coat of primer made my hair stiff, the motion sensor linked to my phone lit up at 5:11 a.m., showing a dark shape prying at the back door with the slow confidence of someone who had tried and succeeded before. I dropped the roller, heart thudding, and stepped into the shadows at the front, every nerve tuned to the sound of metal testing metal. When the shape paused, as if listening, and then turned toward the camera, lifting a face I knew in my bones as well as my own. A face that smiled at the lens like it was a mirror and said something I couldn't hear but understood anyway. He'd found a new table to sit at, and he wanted to see if I'd fold before the first hand was even dealt. The shape at my back door glanced up and smiled into the camera like it was a friend he was about to betray. He cupped his hands to his mouth and said the thing I'd already learned to translate. "We both know you can't keep me out." I called Griffin first because I knew he'd answer, and because men like Adam made a lot of noise but hated witnesses. He showed up in 10 minutes with a thermos of coffee, a length of angle iron, and a seriousness that made my throat ache. We bolted a bar across the inside of the door so heavy it looked like it had grown there. Then I called the precinct and filed a report. When the officer asked if I wanted to press charges for attempted burglary, I said yes. When she asked if I knew the suspect, something in my voice must have shifted because she softened and said, "Do you have someplace to stay tonight? Someone to call if he comes back?" "I have a store to open," I said. "That's where I'll be." The first week in the space, I learned that paint can be a ritual, almost holy enough to rewrite a life. The brick drank white in long, thirsty swaths. I learned how to trace a level line with blue tape and how to sand a cedar shelf until it felt like a word I'd been trying to say. I learned that people in Portland notice when a woman is building something, and they will lean on the door frame and ask what you're making, and if your voice is steadier now than the day you signed the lease, they'll say, "Good." I hung the first copper rod for dresses, and it clanged like a bell in a church I didn't know I'd joined. Leanne from Redux came by with a box of vintage kitchenware that still smelled faintly like a Selwood bungalow. "Your cut is 40%, she said. "Blunt, fair. Don't be shy on pricing. You're not a yard sale." I made consignment contracts with the care of someone weaving a net. I registered an LLC because Latasha said I should. I got liability insurance and a city business license because Khalil did not play. I poured candles at night in the back room while the motion sensor light in the alley kept flashing at cats and wind, and every time it lit up, I felt my spine straighten instead of curl. The first pop-up was the Saturday market. I hauled 2 racks, a folding table, and a borrowed square reader across the Hawthorne Bridge at dawn and set up under a cheap white tent while the river pretended it had always known my name. By 10 a.m., women were thumbing through linen and denim, telling me stories about their grandmothers, asking if I carried 14s and 16s. I did on purpose, and if I knew anyone who could hem their pants, I'd teach them. When a woman in a leather jacket pointed to the sign that said, "Repair night, first Thursdays," and said, "You really going to show people how to sew on a button?" I said yes, and she smiled like I'd told her a secret. "I'll bring my sister," she said. I kept the camera footage of Adam and the police report in a folder labeled Evidence. I printed restraining order forms and filled them out slowly, like a person writing her name for the first time. I learned to say no comment to men who showed up for small talk and wanted access instead. When Naomi called me on a Tuesday evening and said, "He's going to escalate because you didn't scare," I stepped into the alley and let the cold air slap my cheeks awake. "Whose side are you on?" I asked. "I don't do sides," she said. "I do paperwork, and paper doesn't like men who think rules are negotiable. If he shows up again, don't play host. Call it in. I'm documenting his visits as contact attempts with a third-party collector present. It's going to get messy for him if he keeps coming." "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. "Because I've learned that some kindnesses come with strings. Because I wanted to be a person I could recognize in a mirror," she said, and hung up. Grand opening was a Friday in late October. Nights coming early, the street glittering from a rain that made everything look rinsed. I lettered June House in white paint on the glass and stood back and nearly cried, because the reflection showed me a person I'd been building only barely on purpose. The store smelled like cedar and clean linen and maybe a little bit like fear. Griffin brought a plant big enough to look like a small tree and set it in the window like a victory flag. My mother sent flowers from Eugene with a card that said, "I raised you to swim, baby, swim." We had free cider in paper cups and a playlist that made old men nod and teenagers roll their eyes. A bike messenger I'd never met brought friends who posted pictures and tagged the handle I'd made in a coffee shop a lifetime ago. At 6, a woman from Willamette Week wandered in and bought an enamel pitcher and asked if she could take a photo. "We're doing a neighborhood thing," she said. "Small shops that remember your name." At 7:12 p.m., as I was helping a man pick out a gift for his sister and writing her name in a little notebook like I was bookmarking her for the future, the door opened and the temperature in the room dropped by 3 degrees. You don't need to turn to know when a person who refuses to lose has stepped into your house. The conversations went up half a notch to cover a silence that had suddenly become a living thing. Victor stood by the threshold with his hands in his pockets and nodded to me like I'd invited him. The Timbers cap was gone. He'd ironed on, respectability like a shirt. Behind him, Adam followed, thinner than he'd been a month ago, jaw tight in a way that told me he was either not sleeping or not sober. He stared at the sign on the glass like letters could offend him. "Nice place," Victor said lightly. "This is a business," I said, and my voice carried. "Then let's talk business," he said, and stepped inside. The room shifted. People turned and then away in that polite Portland way. I could feel the camera above the door angle down like a witness leaning forward. I had visualized this 100 times. In every version that had made my palms sweat at 3 in the morning, I flubbed my lines or dropped my courage like a glass. I did not flub. I did not drop. "You are trespassing," I said clear. "You are not welcome here. This is your notice." He smiled. "We're just here to pick up what we're owed," he said, looking past me at the register like he could smell cash. "You're here to harass me on behalf of a personal debt that is not mine," I said, and held up my phone. "You're on camera. By stepping one toe past that mat, you've violated a warning and interfered with a business. You are also violating a temporary restraining order filed against Adam. The police have the footage from the last time he tried my door. They told me to call." Victor's eyes flicked to the little black dome above the window. He took a step back that most people would miss, except I was not most people anymore, and I saw all the little movements of a weak man. Behind him, Adam flinched when I said, "restraining order," like the word had finally become a wall he could see. I dialed 911, thumb steady. "I have 2 men in my store on Alberta," I said, projecting my voice so everyone in the room could hear the facts assembling. "One is a collector who has been warned off. The other is violating a restraining order. They are attempting to interfere with my business. I have video. My name is June." Victor said softly to me, "You don't want your nice night ruined, do you?" I smiled with a gentleness I didn't know I possessed. "You already ruined it," I said. "I'm unruining it." The officer arrived in 6 minutes. Naomi arrived in 7, breath frosting in the doorlight. There are images I will rewatch in my head when I am old, and one of them is Naomi standing between 2 men and the door to my store, holding a clipboard like a sword and saying to the officer, "I am a registered collector for Blue Peak Lending. This man," she pointed to Victor, "has no legal standing to collect anything on their behalf, has not been authorized by my firm or our client, and has attempted to intimidate this woman on multiple occasions." The officer looked at where Naomi pointed and said, "Sir, I need you to step outside and answer a few questions." Victor grinned at me like he was trying on a brave face he didn't own and said, Call me when the rent is due and the sale racks don't move." I didn't answer. He hates being ignored more than being hit. He went out. The officer and her partner followed. Naomi stayed. "You okay?" she asked. "I will be," I said, and then the second officer was back, asking my name, my birth date, the shape of the trouble. And then they were putting Adam in handcuffs, not because he'd shouted or swung, he was too cowed in front of an audience for that, but because the order had been served 2 days earlier, and he was less special than he believed himself to be. I thought it would feel victorious, but it felt like watching someone step into a river that had always been there. He stared at me over his shoulder like I had been the one to move the water. "June?" he said, and there was a bottomless, childish outrage in it. How dare you make consequences stick? After they took him and asked Victor if he'd like to be voluntary or complicated, he chose voluntary. Naomi and I stood at the counter while the store thrummed back to life around us. People talked just a bit too loudly. Someone laughed too hard. The receipt printer purred like a small cat coming back to a lap. "He'll be out," Naomi said. "This is a process, but it's a line." "Thank you," I said. "I don't know what you had to do to make yourself okay with this job, but I'm glad you did this part tonight." She shrugged and looked down at the clipboard like it could explain her choices. "Sometimes you pick the right thing because you want to sleep," she said. "Good luck, June." The months that followed were an atlas of small wins pinned onto the wall. Repair night became a thing that women talked about in lines at the grocery store. We fixed buttons and hems and a ripped tent seam that made a man so grateful he cried into his baseball cap. The store's Instagram found the people it was supposed to find. Willamette Week ran a blurb, a home for things that know how to last. The Oregonian wrote a longer piece with a photograph where I looked like I had not slept in a year and was also entirely alive. People brought their grandmothers on Saturdays and their teenagers on Thursdays and their friends from out of town whenever it rained, which is to say, often. Latasha and I met every month with coffee that went cold while we talked numbers. She taught me to see the story in a spreadsheet. And for the first time since the night of the pizza box and the phone glow, the story had a plot I liked. Revenue bending upward, expenses flattening, a break-even point that clicked earlier than projected. Adam pled to misdemeanor violation of a restraining order and misdemeanor attempted burglary. The judge ordered treatment, community service, and a payment plan that included restitution to me for the locks, the security, the lost time. My lawyer filed for dissolution, and the dissipation of assets became a number on a page that shifted, the math in my favor. The final judgment awarded me the store outright and a disproportionate share of what we had left because he had set so much of it on fire. When I signed the decree, my hand didn't shake. Victor disappeared in a way that has the flavor of an agreement. You stop being interesting, and the wolves go look for a brighter porch light. Naomi sent one final email, brief and undeniably tender, that said, "He pled to attempted coercion. It's not a movie ending, but it's something. Stay safe." I printed it and stuck it in the evidence folder, not because I needed proof, but because the arc of a piece of paper can break a heart in the right way. I started placing $10 bills in a cigar box under the counter every time I had a good day. Literal cash. Not because I distrusted banks, but because I wanted weight. At the end of the 9th month, I took the money home and spread it on the kitchen table, the same scarred oak that had first held the ruin. It glowed under the light like scales. I counted slowly. 38,406 in net profit according to the spreadsheet, 9,000 in physical cash from the cigar box that I deposited the next morning like I was returning a body to the earth it came from. Numbers wrote their quiet story across the ledger without drama. Month 10, month 11. On the day the store turned 1, the sun pretended it was a new planet again, hiding and then flaring bright. We baked cookies in my mother's kitchen and brought them to the counter on a plate her mother had used. Griffin made a new wooden sign because the original had warped in the rain. He carved the letters deeper this time, as if to say, permanent. I printed a photo from the motion camera, the one where he had smiled at the lens like the future was his, and slid it into a manila envelope. Then I wrote myself a letter with a subject line that made my ex-lawyer laugh when I later showed her. When you wake up, do not minimize this. You did it. The tally came at 6:14 p.m. on the anniversary night. The register closed with a soft slap, and the printer spat out a strip of numbers that looked boring to anyone else and like fireworks to me. Latasha came by with tea and her laptop, and we ran the books together while customers tried on cardigans and hummed along to a Fleetwood Mac song someone had put into the queue. When the final calculation appeared, Latasha turned the screen toward me and said, "Read it out loud." 44,219, I said, and the store went quiet for a second, as if it understood. "You did it," she said. I poured 2 paper cups of cheap sparkling wine we kept in the back for consignor signings and grandmothers. People clapped because they didn't know why, but could sense that something in the room had happened. I lifted my cup and said, "To the women who hold the line, to the hands that repair, to the days when you break even, and to the miracle of bone growing around a fracture." A teenager in a vintage band tee asked if she could work weekends. A man bought a candle and said, "My sister says this place smells like finally." An older woman pressed my hand and told me she'd left her husband in 1987 and had been waiting since then for the world to catch up with the shape of her decision. After closing, I walked the block alone while the streetlights cast puddles of amber. I passed the barber shop where Griffin had once replaced a mirror, and the bakery that sold bread that didn't need anything on it to taste like a meal. I paused in front of my window and saw my reflection, hair messy from the day, paint still ghosting my nails. The letters June House floated across my chest like I'd been wearing them forever. From our old house on S.E. Clinton, the porch light still faces the street. I haven't lived there in months, but sometimes on my way home I detour, just to see it. If I squint, I can see us at the table on the night everything dropped, the glow off a phone, the way despair can make a person's body so still it looks like a photograph. I'd like to tell that version of me that a ledger is more than numbers. It is a way of saying, I saw the shape of the wound, and I chose to build the scar tissue right on top of it. I see Adam sometimes when I cut across the Laurelhurst Park path early on Sundays. He runs laps now, and sweat makes him human. We don't speak. If he is sorry, it is a private religion. If he is not, that's a private hell. I wish him sobriety. I wish him distance. I wish him the kind of anonymity that makes it impossible for men like Victor to find a porch where someone will answer. On the wall behind my counter, framed in white, hangs the screenshot of our bank account from the night this became a story. $63,017. So precise it feels like an inside joke. Under it, I taped the Register Z report from the 1-year mark, the line that says, net profit, $44,219. Between them is a Polaroid a customer took on opening night of me holding a cup of cider and pretending not to cry. People ask about the collection, and I tell them it's my museum. "Where do you keep the artifacts from the bad guys?" someone asked once, half joking. "In a folder," I said, and smiled so they wouldn't worry. "Marked evidence." "What would you do if they came back?" A regular asked me not long ago, thumbing a ceramic mug like it was a divining bowl. I looked at the door where the motion sensor blinks, at the window where my name floats, at the counter where the receipt printer purrs like a tame machine that only answers to me. "I'd do what I did before," I said. "Hold the line. Make a louder kind of quiet. Build." The house on S.E. Clinton still rattles its keys. The oak table is still scarred. The blue ceramic bowl still waits for change that means nothing and everything. I don't live there now, but sometimes I sit in front of my store before opening and count the women arriving one by one with their hems and broken buttons and stories. And I think about porch lights, about how a knock can be a threat or a promise. These days, when the bell over my door rings, it's mostly people saying hello. But I keep the deadbolt oiled anyway, not out of fear, but out of respect for a boundary that saved my life. On the shelf by the counter, there's a small wooden box with a brass latch. Inside is the first $10 bill I put away on a day that felt like it might break me, the corners creased from my fingers. I touch it like a relic before I turn the sign to open. It feels like a pulse I choose to keep. When the street is quiet and the rain makes the sound I grew up with, I switch off the lights and the glass turns black enough that I can see only my reflection, the letters, and the faint square shadow of the frame where $63.17 lives forever. On those nights, I can hear it, soft as breath, steady as a vow, the store counting for me in the dark, and the number it says is not money. It is every no I learned to say, every door I chose not to answer, and every promise I kept to the woman who told the truth at a kitchen table and then stood up and walked into her life. The end